Here we go again. This is part 3 of a relating of the situation around the difficulties, the seamy side of the hipster movement, the hippie movement, which I was a part of. And they're semi-sequential. The ohms on the shirt remind me of the ohms we chanted without knowing what we were doing. But we were sincere enough, but not knowledgeable at all in what we were attempting to do with the Eastern ideas that were flowing into us. And some of us in the hippie movement were very involved in that spiritual surge. But again, being one of the pioneers is difficult enough, and us pioneers never entirely get it right. It's not possible, since we're in new territory. We were at the time. I had an experience that I would characterize as one of the disasters of mysticism. And I'll tell the whole tale. I think it's worth telling. It'll get out of my system for one thing, and the result will be that I can clear up these memories so there are no hang-ups or residue resentments or anything. And that'll free me from my memory, from my past. I started doing a lot of yoga. I had already been studying with Kanzi. I think I dropped out for a quarter for essentially financial reasons. In any case, I had the leisure time to do the yoga, but I had no instructor other than a yoga book. Unfortunately, because of the way that I study, I had 4 yoga books, and I practiced assiduously using postures and breathings and whatnot from all 4. And there were warnings in the book, at least one of them, do this in this kind of way. And I followed all the warnings. But my lack of understanding and my lack of instruction proved at the time to be personally rather catastrophic. The error that I made was multiple. For one thing, I didn't do the asanas, the postures, for a long enough time. The postures gradually build up a container for the energy, the Kundalini energy. I was sincere but stupid, is what it boils down to, yeah. In any case, I assiduously did the yogas, and then I started changing my diet to a diet suitable to South India, say. You know, lots of milkshakes and yogurts, and a diet suitable to that climate, which is not quite suitable to the climate of Seattle, Washington. Anyway, the other part of my error was to start the breathing exercises too soon, or even to do them at all, not realizing the level of complexity of breathing exercises varies considerably. And it's a very delicate system, the breathing. You don't want to mess with it if you can avoid that. So anyway, I started those exercises too soon, because my asanas had not fully prepared the container. You know, because when you start moving the Kundalini, which is what I did, you know, I read it in one of the books, you can do that. So I started doing that. And the Kundalini is like coiled around the bottom of the spine. And you can bring it up the spine. This is figuratively or metaphorically, or of a lighter material density than the density of the world that we're used to. You know, there's varying densities. Anyway, I did start raising the Kundalini, again, way too early. You know, you have to have a stronger, shall we say, astral body or etheric body to be able to contain the energy. Anyway, I started rolling this metaphorical snake up my spine, and it did reach the heart chakra. You know, you put the energy up from the spine, up the central channel to the various chakras. And I got it up to the heart chakra, then I got it up to the throat chakra, and I think I got it up to the third eye, and then it kind of fell off, so to speak. And several years later, when I was in that Chinese Zen temple, there was a fellow there that had been in the Western occult tradition, and he had third sight. And he asked me one day, "Have you been messing with the Kundalini?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I had experimented with that." And he said, "Well, the Kundalini energy broke through the side, and that's one of the reasons that I got bad digestion. So that had to be gradually healed. You know, and luckily the gentleman was a healer, and it gradually healed up. And then I realized, I basically blew out the central channel. And, you know, you can make the energy flow in any of hundreds of ways. But it's natural, and there's a certain indifference to the natural systems. If you wire the circuit and pull and turn the juice on, then it's going to flow the way you designed the circuit. And if you design the circuit in a non-conducive way, it's going to flow that way anyway. So these things are very delicate, and I was unaware of all that. I was also unaware of the fact that when you do a posture, say you stretch your body up like this, there is, to keep the balance, a counter posture like this. So you're bending your spine one way, then you bend it the other way. It's a way of stretching the spine and opening up the inner channels. But unfortunately, my inner channel was a bit muddy. Anyway, then circumstances from the exterior intervened in my experiment, and somebody apprised me of the fact that Tim Leary was not only in town, but he was going to be at a houseboat in my neighborhood. So a couple of us went over there. And sure enough, Tim Leary was there, but he was hotter than a fox because of the LSD. And, you know, the establishment had turned against LSD. At first it was thought of as a miracle cure. And it is not a panacea, but it does cure a lot of mental afflictions. Anyway, you know what Leary did. He created that incredible circus, and tune in, turn on, drop out, which is things that I did pretty regularly. Anyway, I went to see him, and he had this electron microscope kind of consciousness. You know, he really saw a lot. But he was hotter than a fox, right? And at one point, a judge came in. I don't know what level of judgeship, but he interacted with Leary and was talking about how a lot of the people that he had to sentence that really didn't deserve it for one reason or another that he could perceive. So he was a fairly, not the hanging judge, put it that way, but the opposite kind of judge. Anyway, he paid his respects to Leary and left. And there was other interactions and things that went on. So I went back home and continued my experiment, maybe half a day or a day. And then I ended up, some pot came my way and I smoked a joint. And that combined with the Kundalini overload there that I had created by my foolish attempts to transcend, right? And I fell into a series of negativities. And I ended up mentally connecting in my mind's eye with a world that was insectoid. very hostile some way. And I thought it was happening in physical space rather than in my mind's eye. And so I essentially broke into somebody's houseboat, not the same one, luckily, but somebody's houseboat. And I remember saying, the aliens are coming, and passing out. And, of course, I got busted for that. Yeah. And they had to throw away the key attitude, because I had previous incidents. So this is not necessarily easy to tell, but they took me into a room, and a whole bunch of cops were sitting around in a circle. And I was put in the center of the circle, and along comes a burly cop with kid gloves yet that starts pounding me to a pulp. And I'm down. It was an unprovoked attack, right? I mean, I didn't see that coming at all. And at some point in my physical experience, I realized he wasn't going to stop. And so something in me emerged, pure animal survival. And so I stood up, and the next thing I knew, I was in a rubber room for biting a cop. But as I got up, one of the people in the audience, the cop sitting around watching the show, said, "Oh, gee, he stood up." And then years later, I realized, that was what it was about. As I saw a footage on TV that was fairly appalling, they were tasing some young guy. And again, it was that they weren't going to stop. And the cop even told him, stand up, stand up. And he died. And so there was a bit of a scandal about that. But now why that cop attitude is about, okay, be a man about it, stand up. And that was the lesson, and that's part of the, shall we say, morale of cops, which I find very strange. But, of course, I had a lot of anger and resentment. At the time, I didn't. I was too far gone to even be afraid of anything. In fact, I ended up in that rubber room. I was dancing around naked, and there was a line of Bob Dylan's from Mr. Tambourine Man. Let me dance against the diamond sky with one hand waving free, silhouetted by the sea, silhouetted by the sands, the circus sands, with all memory and fate, driven deep beneath the waves. Let me forget about today until tomorrow. And that's what they call suffering, because now it's tomorrow, and I have had to dredge my memory for that in order to get it out of my system, as it were. Because even though I had a considerable amount of anger and resentment about the whole thing that happened to me, I begin to understand, for one thing, I caused it myself by not being aware of the forces around me, and that further, the resentments that I was holding were harming only me, and so I had to let go of them, and the best way to let go of them is to get them out. That's what a fifth step is about. Anyway, what happened after that? Well, I went way down the tubes. I went down fairly far into the depths of the punitive side of the system, and they did take me down to Western State Hospital, which wasn't quite as difficult a place in that day, in when would it have been 1966 or 7. And I was in Western State for probably a month, maybe 3 weeks, don't know. I know how to act sane in a bourgeois manner, and I played that card again. And it worked. It just took some time. And, I was sincerely turning around in my intention. I was a sincere person, and that means a lot. In other words, I'm able to keep my integrity, and that's more important than a lot of exterior details. I must add, I've had 2 police beatings in my life, and both of them were done in such a skilled manner that I only got bruises that healed up fairly fast. So in both cases, the people that did the beatings were expert in that kind of behavior and expression. And, I could have been seriously messed up in either of those beatings, but I wasn't. So, likewise, the, shall we say, custom, which is probably fairly widespread, of testing people for their survival instinct is maybe valid, maybe not. I don't know. I don't know that much about cop mentality, and certainly not anything at all about cop humor, right? Anyway, in retrospect, it was a real learning experience, and I have benefited by it. Again, it's the refuge in the Buddha Dharma that has gotten me through a lot of this business. I was thinking about the Kundalini Yoga and the fall into that evil insectoid alien world in my mind. And when I raised the Kundalini, it was a fairly subtle body. I don't think it's the body that the adept yogis use, but a subtler material than that. More a mental exercise than a full energy, luckily. Because I overstepped the necessary constraints of that kind of activity. Again, no instructor. I've since taken yoga classes at the YMCA, and straightened out my interaction with the whole yogic tradition. And, the bottom line is I needed an instructor, didn't have one, didn't know I needed one, and so on. So again, we blazed a trail, and the trail has been followed a lot ever since, which I'm grateful for, because that means that the amount of suffering that some of us went through at least had some effect, some positive effect. So when I unrolled the Kundalini, it was exactly like unrolling a kind of snake. A cobra maybe. It maybe didn't have the optimum amount of fire in it, but I was raising some energy, and it was going up the central channel, opening the chakras as it went. But as I say, I was at the throat. I think I got to the third eye rather than just the throat. Don't know. Anyway, then it didn't work anymore. The experiment was partially successful, and the energy, unfortunately, was too much for my system. As to the insectoid aliens, after that quarter, I was able to re-enroll in Kanzi's Buddhist Studies program. And one day he was lecturing, and he had a very curious kind of discourse. He would have a communication that was the main thread, and then there would be parallel communications that were different. Some of them were directed at specific people in the class. And I was sitting there and I was thinking about that insectoid world that I saw, or what it was, what does that incident mean? That, because I certainly was psychotic for a while. It just never lasted, luckily for me. I was diagnosed schizophrenic at the time, but that's a false diagnosis based on the fact that I was eating a lot of LSD, and some of the characteristics of LSD resemble various psychoses. So a psychotic break is one way to break through your over-structured situation, make it simpler some way. I ramble. Anyway, I was thinking about that incident and wondering what it meant, and without breaking the flow of his main discourse, he looked straight at me and he said, "Oh, that was just a demon world." And that understanding freed me from the worry about it, because obviously that was crazy, but obviously I saw something. And he put it in context, in Buddhist context, which is what made me a Buddhist rather than any Western tradition, because the Buddha Dharma understands such things. And no Christians I ever saw understand things at that level. I'm going to do a digression. The hippie interaction with Indians continued on in 1981 on my way back from visiting the Maya land in Mexico. I was at Lama Foundation, and one of the main people there, head of the Christian program, took me in and put me on a work crew, even though I was sick from dysentery and didn't have the strength to lift a shovel barely. But, that was okay. I was still on the crew. I was in. And stayed there for a year and 2 summers. Anyway, one of the incidents, my friend Ron is the first person that I met when I came up to Lama Foundation. And what we used to do is run summer camps, spiritual summer camps. We'd have a 7-day Vipassana meditation. We'd have a 30-day Ram Dass retreat. We'd have wavy gravy and the rainbow, all kinds of really good stuff from the old days. Because by 81, that whole thing had fallen away. That cultural form was already obsolete, excuse me. But is luminous emptiness ever obsolete? Clearly not. But that's another rap. Then one day, a very strange young man came up the mountain, and he said he was Jesus, and he was clearly way out there. And we hung out. My Christian friend took him on, and we did hang out. And it turned out he was one of those acid babies. And he'd been sent to one place after another, hoping somebody could help him, help the kid. His parents were jazz people, I think. And they had dosed him with LSD from a childhood age, and he was a little bit fried. He's seeing constant, practically archetypal visions, this kid. Amazing. And we didn't really know what to do with him or about him. He'd just come from the Himalayan Institute, and I don't know what they did with or for him. But anyway, there he was. And luckily, from the Hopi tribe, and I'm not sure how that connected up, but from the Hopi tribe came Grandfather David, who appeared, at Lama. I don't know if he had been invited or how that happened now. But there he was. Very impressive gentleman. White-haired, very wise and open, high energy. And he told my friend the Christian to do a certain thing with Jesus's situation. I don't know. I think he may have incensed him and washed him down with something, and then anyway, there was an item that had been used in whatever ritual Grandfather David did for him. I think his name might have been Douglas. I'm not sure. Anyway, the instructions were to burn it in a bonfire. And then Grandfather David, finished his visit and went away. And my Christian friend kept neglecting finishing the spell. Whatever ritual had been done, the necessary last step was to burn whatever the item was. And so I had to get on him, make that fire and burn that thing. That was what the grandfather said. And finally we did. And I don't know if it helped him or not. I expect that it did. But, and some of his visions were quite cogent. It's just that the LSD had blown him out. We could go in a long rap about children and drugs and how that ought to be avoided until they at least build a nervous system, because it puts too much stress on the neural system. Again, a podium trip worth staying on, but I'll go on. Anyway, they let me out of the Western State. I re-enrolled in the university in Buddhist studies and kept at it assiduously in some cases. I started studying Abhidharma and had some difficult interactions with my Dharma brothers. And then when Kanzi got deported over the Vietnam War, I think I described on these videos somewhere the situation that got him deported. It's pretty bizarre, but it's what the hippie aspiration to spiritual enlightenment led at least some hippies to. The head of the department, Far East Department at the time, I barely remember his name. There were two high-level administrators involved. The head of the department, I think his name may have been Michael, had been a communist in Germany in the 1930s. And of course they were defeated by the Nazis and had to scatter. Anyway, Kanzi had been a Nazi, had not been a Nazi, had been a communist in Germany in the 1930s. This was a strange story, but he barely escaped from Germany because he was fairly high level, apparently. And he was sent to a diplomatic engagement negotiating on behalf of the party with Hitler, non-aggression pact. They supply gasoline for the Nazi war machine, and the Nazis don't invade them. That was the deal. And he helped plumb that deal. But during the time, a couple of SS officers approached him, and they said, we're Theosophists, and we believe that you have wisdom to share. They were speaking of the Prajnaparamita. And because of that, we're going to warn you that police records from two different venues have been combined. And you're on both lists, which means it's Gestapo time. And so he escaped to England. But without that warning, he wouldn't have done right then. because the cause wasn't totally lost at that point. Anyway, that was his experience. I don't know what Michael's experience was. But Michael was wanted people under his thumb. And having a fellow ex-communist under one's thumb is pretty easy to do because they know the whole structure of the business. Because he wasn't having any, he stood up to him. And, stood up to the idea of a State Department instead of a university humanitarian department of the Far East. So anyway, all that happened. And then everything turned when I joined the Chinese Zen temple. In retrospect, so much of my personality was tied up with being a hippie. Of course it would, with all that experience. And even my negative experiences have taught me so much. The only cure for resentment is forgiveness. And it's like an onion. You keep peeling it and there's still more resentment. But, I'm starting to get to the bottom of it at least. And I find as I can forgive, I'm released from the PTSD part. And this has gradually been happening. Again, I attribute that to the fact that I did find a real connection to Buddha Dharma. And it's gradually opening out. And when I get to the bottom of the last resentment and let that go, then I'm free of the whole business. And that's what's been happening for me. It's amazing. And I got to admit, I paid the dues, I put in the time. So there should be some positive result. That's the law of karma. So I'm not too worried about my next incarnation. And I'm not totally or just barely ready to face my death. But the sad thing for me is seeing my country fall apart around me. And how far it's going to fall apart, whether it'll get turned around or not, is anybody's guess. I would have, shall we say, guarded optimism that it can be pulled out of this tailspin and that the destruction that's been done to the Founding Fathers' intent can be repaired. But that's definitely an opinion. And my motivation here with sharing some of the adventures of being a hippie is partly to get it out of my system, partly to remind people that are doing this thing currently in its metamorphosed form that the roots go back, and they go back to beatniks and Zen, and we were the seeds of the enfolding hippie movement. It was all flower power and love generation and peace, joy, and happiness. And that's how we wanted it, and that's how it is on some level. And I'm grateful for that. I think that's all I really needed to say right now.